One Piece live action is finally out, and then we're going to talk about it. This has been 5, 6, maybe 7 years in the making, and I feel like people want to hear one of two things. Either this is it, this is the curse breaker, this is peak fiction. That, or this is a disaster. Netflix, they've gone and done it again. And my overall impression is that it's not the best thing ever, but it's not a disaster either. It's somewhere very annoyingly in the middle. Which means that before I get into this, I need to give a bit of a disclaimer. My overall feelings on this adaptation are pretty 50-50 split. I loved half of it, and I really did not love the other half of it. Every episode to me was like the horse meme, where half of it was a superb masterwork and the other was like a child's drawing. And something that I want to express is that criticism is never balanced. And what I mean by that is if you say you like something, you don't need to justify it. I can say something like, I liked Luffy because he made me feel happy. And the general response to that would be, all right, cool. Even if you don't agree, because that's my subjective opinion. However, if you say something negative, then all of a sudden you do need to justify it. Because if I said something like, I don't like Luffy, then the response is, but why didn't you like Luffy? What specifically about him was your problem? And internet man, what is your solution to this problem? Because as we all know, if you don't have a solution, then you're not allowed to point out the problems. So criticism works on a 2-to-1 ratio, sometimes even a 3-to-1 ratio, because you need to spend at least twice as long justifying something you didn't like as you would something you did like. All of which is to say that the content of this video is not going to reflect my overall experience, which again, I was pretty 50-50 on this, but I anticipate needing to spend much more time justifying the 50% that I didn't like. And a lot of what I rate the live action based on is how it captures the spirit of One Piece. I don't care if changes are made, I don't care how extreme they are, so long as they stay true to the core of what this series is. And I think that's the only reasonable way to rate it as an adaptation. Also, this video will have spoilers. It's very difficult to talk about criticisms without going into in-depth examples, so there's your warning. But I think the general vibe of this world is executed really well, especially the opening of the first episode. That got me genuinely hyped. And there's a lot of great stylistic choices that I think really add a lot to One Piece. Like the bounty posters. When infamous pirates are introduced, you get this like flash of a bounty poster on screen. And then sometimes the actors interact with them and like grab them off as well. It is so cool. I love that device, and I think I actually prefer it to the standard Oda boxes or Oda text in the anime and manga. The original world elements are also very done in my opinion. I love the design of all of the rooms in Kaya's mansion, for example. The vibe they were going for there was superbly crafted. Buggy's tent was also great. Baratier is a crown jewel of a set, and I completely understand why they kept using it, maybe a bit beyond its relevance, because it's just nice to be in there. Speaking of Buggy's tent, there was a very sinister idea explored in that episode, that he was holding the citizens of Orangetown hostage and forcing them to be part of his show, like forcing them to laugh and applaud. And whilst, yes, super dark, that is also super One Piece. What Buggy was doing here very much reminds me of the Smile Fruits on Wano. People being forced to laugh even in the most twisted scenarios. So that's an example of something that goes in a completely different direction but still retains the raw essence of One Piece. Now with that said, my biggest problem with the series overall is pacing. 8 episodes, it was definitely not enough to cover all of the stories they chose to do. So especially in the first 2 episodes, it feels like we are really speed running One Piece. We're doing all of the things it is we need to do to reach the points we need to get to, but it all feels very mechanical. We weren't really allowed to be there in the moment. So to me, it feels way too fast, but also paradoxically way too slow. Let me explain. The B plot throughout the entire series focuses on the Marines with Garp, Kobe, and Helmeppo, and they take up a lot of time. But as opposed to the A plot of the Straw Hats, who have far too many things to do, the Marines have very little to do. So we often cut from fast-paced Straw Hats doing serious things. We cut from that to Marines talking in rooms. Like we're in the midst of a dangerous pirate plot in Syrup Village, but then we cut to 3 scenes of Garp and Kobe playing Go. Or we have these wild events happening on Baratier, but then we cut to a scene of Garp eating a nice juicy steak with some very slow-moving conversation. So the whole series to me feels very start-stop. With the Straw Hats, we are really putting our foot on the pedal, and with the Marines, we are smashing that brake because we've hit a red light. And I do think it was a mistake to elevate Garp's plotline to this degree, because to make room for it, the Straw Hats don't have any space to breathe. But then when we do cover the Garp story we've made room for, they have far too much room to breathe, because other than a few key moments, there's very little for them to actually do. I think what this series needed was to be at least 10 episodes long, and to heavily reduce or just not include this whole Garp storyline. Because as much as I loved more Kobe and Helmeppo, I don't think it made up for all the shortcuts that needed to be taken with the actual material being adapted. Let's talk about characters though. First of all, Luffy. Almost everyone is saying this, and it's because it's true. Iñaki Godoy is a very solid Luffy. Very different from the manga, but to me, he has the right essence. He's very charming, and I found myself fully on board with his journey. And one thing I was worried about about from the trailer were the Luffy quips that we saw, but most of them surprisingly landed for me. Especially when Luffy first saw Zoro and was like, man, where does that third sword even go? He's just great in general. His stretching, however, is less great. Sometimes it does look good and other times it falls very flat to me. And also it feels very constrictive because as the series goes on, it starts to feel like Luffy is only allowed to use his powers in certain situations, which it is because having him stretch is expensive. So every episode can really only have a select couple of sections where Luffy can actually use his abilities. And to me, that feels a little bit antithetical to Luffy because he doesn't feel free. He feels very restricted by the real-world limitations of television production. Meanwhile, Zoro is very much the opposite. His fight scenes feel fluid because unlike CGI rubber combat, real-world swordplay is something that cinema has very much finessed over time. So Zoro's action tends to feel a lot better than Luffy's to me. And something I enjoyed significantly more than I anticipated was him fighting both Sham and Butchie on Syrup Village. His fight against them in the mansion was so well choreographed and shot, and it might actually be my favorite fight in the entire show. Weirdly enough, for me, Zoro is also the funniest Straw Hat in the show. Zoro got more laughs out of me than I think any non-Helmeppo character because he has a series of great running gags to do with his alcoholism, and also a running gag with Buggy where Zoro just mutters various clown-based insults like stupid clown, which in the final episode caps off with him going fucking clown, which I love, and I think all in all, Zoro translates very well. Meanwhile, Emily Rudd has the best dramatic performance of the show. The scene where she breaks down and starts stabbing her tattoo is portrayed to perfection. And Sanji and Usopp also have very solid performances. Sanji is actually responsible for one of my favorite lines, when Luffy signs the bill at Baratie and says thank you, and then Sanji takes it, looks at it, and just says, "No sir, thank you." Perfect delivery. But the reason why I group Sanji and Usopp together is because I think they both got a bit of a raw deal in the live action, and it's a knock-on effect of the pacing issue. They tried to cram so much into those first 2 episodes, and it created unfortunate problems down the line. For example, we don't see Zoro's flashback during his introduction arc of Shellstown, because there's no time for it. There wasn't even time to see Luffy's whole flashback. So we had to kick Zoro's flashback down the line. So what happens is that it gets inserted into Syrup Village, which makes a decent chunk of Syrup Village feel more like Zoro's story than Usopp's story. I think Usopp also has it rough because he doesn't really get his own moment to shine in Syrup Village. Django isn't in the live action, so Usopp doesn't get to save Kaya, and also he doesn't really get to stand up to Captain Kuro either. Kuro, by the way, very, very well done. I like that they gave him that creepy horror movie villain vibe, and the actor fit Kuro like a glove. Surprisingly, of all characters, Sham and Butchie I also really enjoyed. Definitely much more so than I enjoyed them in the manga and anime. But back to Usopp, he kind of feels like a bystander in his own arc. Like, he was there and afterwards he joins the crew, but it feels very lacking. Something is missing. And to me, Sanji has a similar problem. Baratie receives probably the most brutal story plundering as it removes the entire Don Krieg assault, aka the main conflict of the arc. And that's problematic because watching Luffy take on Don Krieg and defend the restaurant is a big factor in Sanji deciding to pursue his dream, because Luffy's determination showed Sanji that his dreams can indeed be pursued. Also, something that just baffles me is that Sanji wasn't present for the Zoro-Mihawk fight, because that is such an integral moment for Sanji. He's watching Zoro put his life on the line for his dream, someone who would rather die than not chase his passion, which in conjunction with Luffy is what pushes Sanji to set out to achieve his dream. And the live action has none of that, which to me does go against a core tenet of One Piece. Sanji never really has to reckon with or have an epiphany regarding his dream, and the whole reason why Sanji leaves is because that stuffy old Zeph won't let him deviate from the menu. Bad Zeph. And it even made me laugh when they had their argument. I think Sanji said something like, yeah, well, the chore boy offered me a job, so I'm gonna go do that. And I'm like, why? What has Luffy shown you at this point that makes you want to follow him? Because all that happened on Baratie is Luffy not paying his bill and then getting his ass kicked by Arlong. I want to know where that moment was where Sanji went, yeah, that's my captain. Speaking of that captain moment though, something the live action does a bit confusingly is when and how people actually join the crew. So for the first 2 episodes, Nami and Zoro are insistent that they are not a crew. That's the gag. Zoro never joins Luffy during Shellstown. He just escapes with him for convenience. And this is a point that Nami and Zoro are quite militant about. They are not a crew. But that gag abruptly ends, and in episode 3 and 4, I don't think they ever address it. So there's still no crew. But then there's a point during episode 5 when Nami says to Zoro, well, you're the first mate. And I found that jarring because at this point, Zoro has not actually joined the crew. He was just there. He only actually joins in the next episode after the fight with Mihawk. And technically, I think that Usopp is the first person to actually join the crew in the live action adaptation. Now I have to mention Buggy though, because he is a definite highlight. Perfect casting, amazing performance, and a solid gem of an experience during the early episodes. What surprised me most were his devil fruit abilities. The Chop Chop fruit, I think has the best CGI in the entire series. It just feels good, you know? And the cinematography combined with the floating body parts was excellent. Now, Buggy does have an extended role in the series. In fact, he's present for the whole series, really. And I will say that this does get a little bit old towards the end, especially in episode 8, where he's pretty much just been reduced to a wisecracking head. I actually really like the idea of the crew just traveling with Buggy's head. It's a very fun idea that I'd like to see in the actual manga. But towards the end, it's a bit like, yeah, we get your gimmick. You make show puns. And actually, his last line before he leaves the crew feels particularly lazy to me because it's just, I think that it's time to exit stage left. And it's just like, really? You couldn't have come up with anything better than quite possibly the most overused theater idiom in human history? In fact, that was a moment where it felt like I was watching the 4Kids dub. That is the level that particular line writing was on. But otherwise, I loved Buggy. And do you see what I mean about criticism not being balanced? I liked pretty much everything about Buggy, but the one thing it is that I didn't like takes the most time to explain why. Now, more explaining, the flashbacks. The flashbacks are a very mixed bag. The child actors, very hit and miss. But with that said, I think that the flashbacks themselves are mostly very good. My major problem with them is how they were chopped up and just sprinkled into the series, often at seemingly arbitrary times. I think it was a big mistake in particular to split Luffy's flashback into small chunks across 2 episodes, because it breaks the flow of his story like 5 or 6 times, and it doesn't really allow for me to get invested into the backstory, because it keeps getting interrupted with a bombardment of modern day events that completely switch focus. My favorite flashback in the show was Sanji's, and it's because it's told as a one and done. You get to see the beginning, then you get to see the middle, then you get to see the end. So you get to feel all of the feelings, you get to feel them build up, and you get to feel them pay off at the right time. It was great, I loved it. And I'm not saying that you do need to strictly adhere to a one-to-one adaptation, but there is a reason why Oda tells all of the important flashbacks in one go. And it's because they're the main emotional meat of One Piece. You need to be immersed into them. And that became very difficult for me to do because they kept getting interrupted. But I interrupt this complaining now to bring you my favorite character, Helmeppo. Unironically, my favorite character in the entire show. And also responsible for one of my favorite scenes in the show. I don't think that I or anyone else expected to see bare Helmeppo ass, but I think it makes sense. We are, of course, missing the butt chin, so we've got to make up for that with, I guess, the butt. And I cannot praise the performance of Aiden Scott enough. He elevates Helmeppo and nails that perfect balance between complete and utter prick, but also kind of sympathetic. And by the end, I was absolutely rooting for him. A lot of additions I really loved in the live action were scenes of Kobe and Helmeppo together. It was really fun to see that rivalry and eventual friendship developing. And really, my only complaint here is that there was not enough Helmeppo. I really would have traded so many Garp scenes for more just Kobe and Helmeppo. As for Helmeppo's father though, I have to say at the end of episode 1, I found myself asking, why is Captain Morgan the villain? Like, I know why we're fighting him because that's what happens in the manga. But other than hitting Helmeppo and I guess threatening Zoro, he didn't do anything particularly villainous. And I would argue that hitting Helmeppo actually makes him even more likable because we're not supposed to like Helmeppo, so it's nice that he's getting what's coming to him. And for me, it's an example of a character that did fail to capture his original spirit. Remember that in the manga, this is a guy who murdered one of his subordinates and subsequently ordered his remaining subordinates to then murder a little girl. This guy was painted as an urgent force of brutal tyranny that needed to be stopped now. In the live action, he's a narcissistic dick, but there's nothing that really makes me go, yeah, he really needs to be defeated, like right now. And it's a perplexing decision because Morgan is such an easy character to land. He is both literally and figuratively a 2D villain. He's a bad guy who does bad things, but in the live action, they don't show him doing the really bad things. So as a result, he comes off a bit more as just a guy doing things. So in episode 2, when Garp publicly crucifies him, I'm like, Garp, mate, this is a bit overboard. What is Scottish Grandad doing? Now, speaking of, Garp, I think is the biggest misfire of the show. And I've gone over why I think that is in regards to his plotline, but I also think it's a serious miscalculation of his character. The actor does a great job with what he's given. He looks and feels like he could be Garp, but his actions and dialogue, in my opinion, fail to capture the essence of Garp. Because I guess he's painted as a bit of a nebulous existence. Like if you're completely new to One Piece, I guess you're not quite sure if he's meant to be a good guy or a bad guy. I mean, I do find it weird that Garp would do something like call a warlord of the sea. Not so much that Garp would do that. I find it weirder that Mihawk would actually obey that command, but that's a whole different thing. Overall though, Garp just does not land for me, because he's portrayed throughout the series as consistently incompetent. He spends the whole series pursuing and somehow being foiled by Luffy and his band of misfits. There was a point to myself where I said, this is Garp the hero, and he was stopped by a single rogue cannonball hitting his shipmast, which he then threw a tantrum over. He throws multiple tantrums actually that start out as a burst of anger and then become uncontrollable uncontrollable laughter, and it's uncomfortable. It's like watching someone having a mental breakdown and not knowing how or if you should help them. That, or you know what? It's like watching the villain of a movie whose main protagonist is a dog. Every time Garp throws one of those tantrums, it's like, oh, that damn dog, I'll get him. And at those points, it's just like, congratulations. You've turned the most legendary Marine to have ever lived into a whinging man-child who is so pathetic at his job that he can't even catch a single rookie pirate in East Blue. Now, before you do all of the comments and things, there is an explanation for this, but I just don't buy it. At the end, it's revealed that Garp was doing all of this just to test Luffy, as if his grandson's entire journey so far had been on training wheels, as if Garp had been wasting the Marine's time and resources training his grandson to go out and become a pirate, an idea that Garp to his core absolutely detests, so why would he do it? Why would he do it? I never once watched Garp and thought I was watching Garp, which is a problem I had with very few characters. Luffy, for example, when I watched Luffy, yes, I know that this is not the manga Luffy. It's a different Luffy, but he still has the heart of Luffy. But other than physical appearance, there is nothing recognizable about Garp in this show. Alright, and I also seem to have another note written. Shellstown bar scene. What was that about? Oh, right. Okay. More complaining. The Shellstown bar scene in episode 1 really didn't sit well with me. As a quick what happened, Rika gives Zoro the rice balls. Why does she do it? I don't know. It doesn't matter, I guess, because it happened in the manga. But then Rika bumps into Helmeppo, and Helmeppo is a dick to her. So we have a great character moment for Zoro here, because he picks up the rice bowl that Helmeppo stood on, and he eats it, and he goes, delicious. Just like that. Everything's going pretty well at this point, but then Zoro goads Helmeppo into conflict. He's like, apologize, or else. And the reason why I take issue with this is because later on, when Luffy is talking to Zoro, Luffy says, I know you protected that little girl. And I'm sitting here like, no, he didn't. Helmeppo was about to turn his attention away entirely and the situation would have been diffused. But then it was Zoro who made the decision to escalate the conflict. And if anything, Zoro put Rika in more danger by deliberately instigating a bar fight. And this is in the exact same episode where we see Shanks's bar interaction with Higuma. Now, in context of the episode, yeah, it does make a bit of sense, because Luffy's flashback, as I've said, is fragmented, and all we know by this point is that child Luffy hated how Shanks reacted by choosing not to fight. So it seems like a natural thing, right? Now he admires Zoro because he is choosing to fight in this situation. Because what child Luffy would have wanted to do is for Shanks to fight. But retrospectively, it doesn't make sense because we haven't seen the rest of that flashback. Because in the end, Luffy understands that Shanks did the right thing. He took that lesson on board, that lesson that Luffy in Shellstown would now assumedly know, which he would go on to famously replicate during Gyre. So it feels really off to me that Luffy is admiring someone who acts more like a Higuma than he does a Shanks. It feels to me like a potential editing issue. Like maybe they had to cut out or reshoot Helmeppo physically threatening Rika, either for time or for some other reason. But as it stands in the live action, Zoro is the instigator here. Helmeppo was about to go away and forget everything about this day, but Zoro pushed the matter and started the bar fight. So again, the overall content and tone of this video does not reflect the experience I had watching the live action. It was genuinely fun, and you can feel the love poured into every frame. Every time there's a detailed set, you can pause it and discover like a gazillion fun references. This series is definitely not short on passion, and I think that as a result, One Piece fans specifically will enjoy it, because it's a bombardment of references and some interesting reworkings of things we already know. But I do genuinely fear how a more general audience is going to react to it, because as a live action adaptation, specifically a Western one, yeah, it's probably the best that's ever been made. But is that a high bar? Because when you consider it as just another TV show competing with all of the other TV shows, I don't think that this one is setting the world on fire. I don't think it's going to kickstart the new era of One Piece, but it is a fun novel experience for current fans of the series. It's not phenomenal, it's not a disaster, it just is.